Hello, students. I hope all is well. I'm feeling okay. I still have a cough, and I'm sorry I can't be with you this week, especially for this super exciting part of history. You know, I love all history, but this is a very exciting part of world history right here, of course, World War II. I'm making one recording for both my middle school and high school group. Middle schoolers, you'll have a couple of bonuses on here because there's a couple of things in here that I was not going to cover with you. So if you have a sibling in the class, y'all might want to watch it together. Okay. All right. So in order to figure out what's going on in this world conflict, I'm going to have to change gears a couple of times. So I'm going to start here with what was happening in Japan. And so we can figure out why America got into the war, and then we will go back and figure out what was happening with Europe. The Europeans really, really wanted America to help join in to take care of the conflict because, as you know, we talked about last time, Hitler had come run through France, and France was completely overtaken. And so Europe, UK, England was pretty much alone fighting the war. And America was wanting to keep out of it. You know, it had only been 24 years or so since the last conflict, which was horrible. And so America was involved politically in the sense that we had a deal worked out with European countries to sell them material, food, things like this. So we politically were on the side of the Allied powers, which would have been the England and France and Russia. Okay, so we're going to see then that America, just like in World War I, remember America got pulled in when the Germans made that mistake of trying to get Mexico to declare war against us, and also that bombing of the Lusitania. Remember, those things brought America into the war. So we're going to see something drastic is going to happen this week too to bring America into the war. All right, so let's talk about Japan. Japan is an island nation out in the Pacific. Notice it's very close to the continent where Russia, China, and the Koreas are. It is a volcanic island. Therefore, all along the islands here, there's very mountainous, volcanic, in fact. And because of that, the amount of land available for farming is very limited. So the Japanese they don't have very many natural resources in this island nation, so they need to access these through certain means. One of the ways, of course, would be to take them. So remember what happened in the Koreas. They actually invaded North and South Korea. That was just one Korea at the time. And they took over there. So at this point in time, Japan is in charge of the Koreas. And we're gonna see they're gonna start pushing up aggressively up into China now as well. Okay, so because they're trying to get some resources. The other thing they could do is trade, right? So in other words, if they establish a robust trade agreement with different countries, they could get food brought in and things like this. But at this point in time, they were going to be aggressively looking for materials by taking them. So let's see. This is the emperor at the time. His name is Hirohito. And Hirohito had become the emperor about 20 years before the big war is going to begin, when he was only about 20 years old. So he was a young man. And here in the 1930s, he would have only been emperor for about 10 years. And the emperor in Japan is thought of as a deity, as a god. And so he is listened to very carefully. Although he doesn't really make any public appearances, he is worshipped somewhat by the people. And so his chief general right here, Hideki Tojo, and his prime minister was really the one that talked the the emperor into aggressively looking for more land to expand Japanese territory. And so this is Tojo. We will just call him Tojo. You'll see as we go through here. He is the mastermind behind a pretty brilliant military campaign that took place. In fact, at the beginning, he seemed absolutely unbeatable. This flag we're looking at here is the battle flag of the Japanese. It shows the sun on it. That is because Japan is considered the land of the rising sun. The day begins over there. And that those rays are going to reach out, and we're going to have this aggressive kind of pursuit of other areas, including China. All right, so they were already in the Koreas, and we're going to see they have a army invasion of Manchuria. Now, Manchuria is in the southern part of China, and China, keep in mind, was an ally of the United States at this time. All right, and so when Japan started moving into the southern part here, the Chinese got a little panicked and asked the Americans for help. And the Americans are looking at, well, we can see what we can do, but they don't want to get involved in a particular war. We'll see how they help them. Notice this picture shows the people of China waving their Japanese flags. That's the white flag with the red circle on it. That's propaganda showing that the Japanese were welcomed into Manchuria. That wasn't exactly the case. This was a military invasion. The people in China were very, very concerned about this. Now, Manchuria is in the southern part right there, and so China, of course, is just biding their time until they move into China proper, at which time we'll be actually in the throes of war. Okay, so you can see here how they invaded that area right there. So notice they would have had access to that Eastern Railway. Guess what a railway can do? We can bring in materials, right? We can trade this kind of thing. But they moved in aggressively and took over. Some of the cities that did not, quote unquote, welcome them in were absolutely destroyed by the Japanese. They really showed they were really very brutal when it came to war. They believed in total victory. And if you fought against them, they really let you have it. Okay, so we'll see that how it manifests here in just a minute. Here they are rolling into one of those cities that they destroyed. I believe this is a picture of them rolling into Nanking. Now the rest of the world is starting to get a little concerned at this point. Meanwhile, at this same time, we have Hitler doing those things over in Germany. It's not quite to where the war is going to be declared quite yet, but so this is all happening in the 30s. Okay, and so the whole world seems like it's having these aggressive moves by these different governments, and we're going to see that it's going to ultimately end up where it's a world war. Now, one thing that the Japanese wanted more than anything was oil. All right, so they need oil to run their army, to run their tanks. Oil is used for many, many things, but chiefly, as we know, it's used for fuel, for gasoline, for the ships and things like this. Japan had a massive navy, and they needed oil to run those ships. And they were trading with America for that. Well, America wanted to punish Japan for this aggressive move in China, one of our allies, and they therefore put an embargo on oil, which means we refused to sell it to them. And furthermore, America pressured the rest of the world to refuse to sell to the Japanese. And if we can keep them from moving their army around, we can check their progress, right? And then the Japanese were very, of course, upset about this, and it made them angry at America. Now, politically, the people in running our country knew this. They knew the Japanese would maybe strike at America. And right here you can see China up here, but Japan, you can see a Japanese island here, but Japan's up this way. Well, the Japanese figured they could make a deal with the Dutch East Indies, somehow get oil from them over here in those yellow islands down there. You can see there's a German colony down there and these Dutch colonies, but there was something that stood in the way, and it's right here. Okay, the Philippine Islands were owned by the USA. We had won those after a war with Spain called the Spanish-American War, and we had been in control of the Philippines for some time then, so at this point about 30 years. The Filipinos, by the way, were not happy with America being in charge of them. They had been under the thumb of Spain for a long time, and then when we fought with Spain and defeated Spain, we took over the Philippines, which was probably the time in American history where we were the most colonizing, so we had this colony over there. We actually had a war with the Philippines called the Philippine War, which the Americans won and kind of kept the Philippines under our thumb. We're going to see how we're going to work together with them during the World War II, and after everything is said and done, America will indeed give the Philippines their independence. But at this moment in time, the USA is in charge of this, so Japan realizes in order to get to someone who might trade with them, the Dutch, then they're going to have to get through America. So they came up with a plan. We were very concerned that the Philippines would be attacked. We have several army bases there at the time. We had lots of soldiers stationed in the Philippines, and one of our most famous generals was there. We'll get to him. and we were concerned the Japanese would attack. What we didn't really know was that the Japanese were also interested in way out here in the ocean, way out here, is there are some other islands there as well that the United States was in charge of. All right, which brings us to this date, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. All right, so an attack is certainly going to come, which we anticipated, but it didn't happen in the Philippines. Where did it happen? It happened in Hawaii. All right. So what is going on with Hawaii? Right here we can see the actual attack. This is, I don't know if this is from a movie maybe. These pictures right here. It's quite a fascinating picture. But the attack came on our naval base that was in Hawaii. All right. So the Hawaiian Islands were not a state of the United States at the time. They were just a kind of a colony. We had sort of like with the Philippines, we had taken over. And right here is the island of Oahu. If any of you've been, Oahu is the main political center of Hawaii. In fact, Honolulu is the capital of Hawaii today. At the time, it was a large city, and we had a base stationed at this really excellent area right in here. There's a lovely harbor right in here, very protective, called Pearl Harbor. Here are some of the Japanese planes that came flying in over Pearl Harbor. They were stationed off of aircraft carriers to bring them closer to Hawaii. So we didn't really anticipate them coming there because they were so far. They were very close to the Philippines, and Hawaii was much farther away. But they had these incredible flat tops, we call them. Those are aircraft carriers. All right, so I like this picture right here. I believe it's on a floor. If you go visit Pearl Harbor, you'll see this kind of thing right here. All right, so Honolulu's over here, okay? And here's the harbor. See how that water comes up in here? There's Pearl City. And it's a very protective harbor. All right, so this harbor harbor means to be protected, right? And so we can see that we had an Army base up here called Schofield, with their Wheeler Field, because we had the Army Air Corps. And we have Hickam Field right down here, which is a different group, which today is at Air Force Base, but at the time would have been Army Air Corps Base. And we had our boats all parked in here. And we had a large Navy. We weren't necessarily, we were considering that war might be in the future for us, of course. But at this point in time, we didn't realize that our guys were sitting ducks. Okay, so these arrows here show the pathways of the Japanese planes coming in. They came down from the north and came sweeping over. They bombed Schofield. They came in, and of course, they're going to bomb this area right here. Here is where our ships were parked. So you can see right here, our ships are all, it's called Battlefield Row or something like this. And you can see if they're red, that means this day they got sunk by bombs coming in. If they're yellow, they were damaged. Most of those were put back into service. And then some of our smaller ships as well. And so the Japanese came in. They started dropping bombs. When they first started flying in, it was a little confusing. It was early on a Sunday morning, like 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And the watchtowers who were watching the sky saw planes coming, and they kind of thought they were our planes because our flat tops, our aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that day. They were out in the ocean having war games. And so when these planes started coming, they said, oh, look, they've sent some of the planes in. And then they realized they were actually Japanese Zeros. And then, of course, it was very clear when the bombing started happening. And one of the most famous of our ships to be sunk, of course, is the Arizona. Right here, it got absolutely just blown. It actually exploded from the inside. And the men were trapped in it. It was horrible. That's the place, if you go to Pearl Harbor today, they have the Arizona under the water, which you can go stand and look at it from above, and, the men who were in there, that's their grave, very sad right there. But we were definitely damaged horribly on that day. But here were the Japanese planes coming in off of their aircraft carriers. And this, of course, is going to cause there to be war. So the president stood up, and literally he stood up. He had, couldn't use his legs, so he put some braces on and was able to stand to give this speech. If you know anything about Franklin Roosevelt, he had a debilitating disease where he could not walk. But here's his quote. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. So he made his, here he is in Congress, asking Congress to declare war on Japan, which they did. And it became very clear. Something like this, obviously, we couldn't just stand by. This was an attack on American people. So we have to have a response. So they declared war on Japan, and right away Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. So now we're back at a world war. Hitler was really very excited about this because he thought if he could keep America preoccupied with Japan, that he could dispatch England fairly easily, that America wouldn't be able to come over and help with the English. Now I will say that Winston Churchill got together with Franklin Roosevelt and they devised a plan. Roosevelt, of course, needed to answer the Japanese, so he has a big buildup of the Navy, and we're going to have this, what we call the Pacific Theater. But the United Kingdom really wanted America to come help against the Germans, and so we had to work out a deal. So we're going to see how Americans pursued the Japanese. They wanted the British to come help us against the Japanese, and they will later. But right now they're dealing with Germany, right? So we're going to have this two-front war, really three, and I'm going to take us now through the Pacific part of it. All right, so here, anything that's green was part of the Allied nations, the good guys, and anything that's red or orange are the Axis nations, who are the bad guys. And then we do have some neutral nations as well. The yellow right here, I don't know why we can't see that. The yellow right here is actually Vichy, France. Okay, so you can see that now where it says Vichy territory. So here in Africa, and then the lower part of France. Remember, Vichy were the French who were the puppets of the Nazi regime. Okay, so they were under the oppressive nature of the Germans, but they were still French who were running the countries. They were considered traitors, in fact. All right. So notice over here, Japan, all these areas. Japan will eventually, they did attack the Philippines the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. There's also an island out here called Wake Island, which they attacked and ran over pretty easily. The Philippines we'll get to here in a minute. We had some Americans already in China. They had actually been there to train the Chinese how to fly planes. And our group that were over there were called the Flying Tigers. You can see their aircraft here, which is actually painted to look like a shark, but they're known as the Flying Tigers. They had been training the Chinese. Now, there's a really great movie with John Wayne called The Flying Tigers, and it shows how, because they were there already training, when all this went down, when all this happened, we had American fighter pilots right there ready to go and engage with Japanese. So pretty amazing. This is a group of Flying Tigers at the time. They became sort of like, the big heroes. I will tell you, fighter pilots' lifespan was short typically. When I teach American history, we would go through and find out specific guys. But since we're doing world history, we will kind of gloss over the American heroes at this point and just look more at world heroes. Okay, so here's our Navy. Now, we did recover from, some of our battleships were not recoverable after the attack. Some of the ones that were damaged were repaired. So this man, his name is William Bull Halsey, and this man, whose name is Admiral Chester Nimitz, they were in charge of beefing up the Navy. Now that we're at war, they had to get them fixed up. Furthermore, America here on the mainland went into production of more battleships. And fortunately, like I said, our flat tops, our aircraft carriers, were not at Pearl Harbor, so they were ready to go. You may recognize the name Nimitz over here. This is Chester Nimitz. He's from Texas. He was raised in Fredericksburg, Texas. And if you go to Fredericksburg, you can go check out the Nimitz Hotel. I don't know if it's still a hotel. It might be a museum now. But that was his family's hotel right there in Fredericksburg. Furthermore, if you get a chance to go to Fredericksburg, they have an outstanding museum called the Museum of the War of the Pacific. So, and that's because of Nimitz there. Some excellent, I would love to take a field trip or something there. They have excellent displays on what was going on only on that side of the Pacific. So when we look at the Pacific theater of the war, it is mostly Japan versus USA. We do have British helpers. Some British who were already there for other reasons are going to end up being taken prisoner and things like this. But for the most part, the War of the Pacific was an American versus Japanese war. Okay, as the Japanese attacked, they were winning everything. Okay, so they invaded, we see they were up in Manchuria. Look in the southern part now, down here in this part of China. They invaded this. They're going to invade right here. It's called French Indochina. This is, Vietnam is right over here. And the French that was their colony. They were overrun by the Philippines. I mean, excuse me, by the Japanese. The Philippines, we're going to see here specifically, were invaded. The Dutch East Indies were apparently they were able to get access to oil. And then look at, here's New Guinea. Look what's very close. Right here is Australia. As you can imagine, Australia was on the side of the Allies. It's allied with England. But they were winning everything. And in 1942, so remember, Pearl Harbor happened in December of 41. So in 1942, things were looking very, very bleak for the Americans because the Japanese were unstoppable. Notice here's Wake Island. That was attacked on December 7th as well and taken. The Americans were there. It's a little tiny, tiny little atoll of an island. But it was completely overrun. Okay, here we can see those attacks coming in from Japan to all these areas. And notice it was against England. It says there New Britain, Papua New Guinea, Australia. The Portuguese even were involved, so you can see it's truly a world war at this point. Okay, there is a raid on Australia right here at a town called Darwin at the top of northern part of Australia. Let's watch just a little clip from the movie Australia. All right, you get the idea? It was their version of Pearl Harbor. Okay, so that happened after Pearl Harbor, but it was a surprise attack on Australia. All right, so this is one of our most famous generals, one of our famous U.S. generals, Douglas MacArthur. He had been in the Philippines with armies there and our bases and things like this. Well, he was ordered out. Now, there's one thing that Army guys don't like to do, and that's to leave their troops. But MacArthur had to get out. He was ordered out of the Philippines. So we can see here the upper island called Luzon is the main island of the Philippines. On December 10th, we have the invasion of the Japanese. They are literally landing boots on the ground. Our guys are in Luzon. They're being chased all the way down. They're also reeling from somewhat of a surprise. It seems like we would have been a little more prepared at this point, but apparently not. So we're going to end up down here at the Bataan Peninsula, right here. Okay, so they're going to be at the end of this peninsula, and they don't have anywhere else to go because they're stuck on the end of the peninsula. And here is that peninsula right there. And you can see what happened is that our guys stopped. They made this line, and they're going to stop to face the invasion of the Japanese. Okay, we're going to see later how this island of Corregidor right here would become a place where some of our people went to barricade themselves. But at this point, MacArthur had to leave the Bataan Peninsula. He actually took a ship down into Australia. The men were all left behind, sadly, though. And here is his great quote, "I came out of Bataan and I shall return." We see that he will. Okay. So now, eventually, the Allies, they put up a fight. They had to. Now, who is fighting there? We have an American troops, and we also have Filipino troops that are fighting with us. At this point, we have made that deal that if they fight with us against the Japanese, that we will give them independence after the war. So they're fighting with us. The Japanese despised the Filipinos. They thought of them as racially inferior and really, really despised them. Furthermore, if anyone showed any sign of weakness or anything like that, the Japanese found that to be disgusting. So they were going to march them back up to a camp. We call this the Bataan Death March. You can see on the picture on the right, it's hot and dusty. I don't know if I have a date here. I think we're at the summertime by now. And anytime that these guys would maybe fall by the wayside, if they got real, they didn't give them very much water or food during this march. And if they sat down or anything like that, the Japanese would just bayonet them. They would just kill them right there along on the march. They showed no compassion at all. But their idea was to get them up to the railroad so they could get on over here to what is called Camp O'Donnell. And that is a concentration camp. And we always hear stories about the German concentration camps and how horrible they are. Well, I don't know, y'all. The Japanese were pretty horrible in they were military camps. So the ones that make the Germans so horrible is that they had civilians in there. Obviously, they had Jews and things like that. But we're going to see how they were not treated well at all once they were put in camps. But they were stuck up there at Camp O'Donnell, and America's having to regroup. So things are looking very bleak at this point. We had one bright spot in April of 1942. We have a raid being carried out on Japan itself. Okay, this is known as the Doolittle Raid. If you have seen the movie called Pearl Harbor, which I don't know if I can recommend it, but if you've seen it, I believe that's Ben Affleck and some other guys. Well, they show this Doolittle Raid, which is actually very good. What they decided to do was they're going to go bomb Japan. And they knew that it wasn't going to be strategically super important, but it would be psychologically important if they could show Japan that we can bomb them too. And we ended up taking off from aircraft carriers. This is not a fighter jet. This is a bomber. All right, so to get a bomber to take off of a aircraft carrier is a big ask right there. They're much heavier planes. They usually need a longer runway. And so they did some special things to the planes. They stripped everything from inside of it that was absolutely not necessary so they could carry bombs. And they actually did make it over. Here they are coming off the ship, and they dropped the bombs on Tokyo right here. And then the idea was that they would then drop the bombs and then move over to and land in China that was still part of Allied, where the Japanese weren't. Sadly, some of those guys ended up as Japanese prisoners. Some of the guys ended up dying in the raid itself, and then some actually were rescued, including Jimmy Doolittle, who was running the raid right there. It's a really a great story. Once again, more of an American story. All right, so we have the Battle of the Coral Sea. We have all these islands in here. So picture all of our ships floating around out there in the Pacific and then engaging in certain battles. We finally had a victory at the Battle of the Coral Sea, all right, where we sunk a couple of the Japanese ships. So finally, we started to see that there was something that we could do to fight against them. All right, so things are starting to look a little better, and then it's going to devolve into a air war. So our flat tops became the most important parts. So our aircraft carriers became the most important parts of the war. We hadn't really anticipated that beforehand, but now we're going to see how airplanes are going to be doing dogfights. Airplanes are coming in and dropping bombs on battleships, on aircraft carriers, and things like that. We come now to the turning point where when things were looking terrible for America, awful, awful, we're going to see a turning point, and it's at the Battle of Midway. How apt is that, right? So right midway, we're going to see a big turning point. So here come our fighter jets, our fighter pilots, coming in, and notice on the Japanese flat top here, the aircraft carrier, they had their little red sun on there, you know, because that's their insignia. A lot of our fighter pilots said that they used that as a target, and they came in and they would drop their bombs right on there, and we were actually very successful taking out some Japanese ships, and it kind of surprised them, really. All right, so you can see here's Midway. It's not even a dot on the map because it's so small. See where Hawaii is? Yeah. And the Japanese had taken all of this, and now we're going to now start moving in. So it's going to become a grueling war, taking island by island, you know, island hopping, they called it. It was brutal, and the Japanese were very tenacious. There's Midway. All right, so here's our island hopping. You can see every one of these are battles. Here's our Pearl Harbor, obviously. We have Midway, and then you can see the dates of all these places here. Saipan, Coral Sea down here in May, and then June was Midway, was a big victory. And then we can see different battles over here, okay? We're going to get to some of the important ones. Here we have Okinawa and Iwo Jima, which are going to be, notice how this happened in 42. We didn't get to Iwo Jima until 45. Wow, I mean, this was really dragging on. Also, keep in mind there was stuff happening over in Europe too, okay? All right, Guadalcanal was brutal. It is the battle that we can see the Americans would be the blue arrows, the red are the Japanese right here. And there was an amphibious landing down here on Guadalcanal Island. And every time you're going to come on a beach like this that's called an amphibious landing, it's a rough deal because you're coming in to an island that's already occupied by the enemy. They typically will have the high ground. See, we can see here there's a ridge right here. So when our guys start to land, the Japanese were ready to just start mowing them down right here. But we're going to see how our guys landed, came in here, and Guadalcanal was a brutal, brutal fight. Here they are fighting, look, trying to come on the island right here. So they're trying to enter the beach, and we have our guys shooting against them right here. Brutal. But we had a new weapon. It's called the B-29 Super Fortress. It is a bomber, and it has some big bombs that it can drop, okay? And it can go a long distance because they are have a lot of fuel, and so they can fly a long distance, drop bombs, and get away. Here are some of them flying. Notice also, does it show it very well here? We have fighter pilots who escort them, all right, because some of the Japanese airplanes would have come to try to shoot them down, and so we would engage those with our fighter pilots, those escorts, so that our bombers could get through. Notice here we have, here's where the pilot would be. We have a gunner up here who can shoot at planes coming toward us. We have a belly gunner down here who can shoot people coming from beneath. We have a tail gunner down here, and then there's a gunner right over here as well. And so there are guys sitting in that little dome right there looking out to see if they need to shoot at any planes that are coming toward them. Very frightening. All right, so the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, they call it, where we have planes up in the air dropping bombs. We have planes coming in for dogfight type of situations. We can see here Guam, right, which was actually an American island and still is today. And then we're going to see over here in the Philippines. We know that the Japanese own the Philippines at this point, so they'll come out, and we're going to see how the battles are going to move up here toward the north. This is just a picture of one of our fighter pilots. He's holding up 6 fingers. I don't know if that means he got 6 planes. That would be a day right there. He would be already an ace flyer if that's the case. Getting 6 planes would be incredible. Here are some of our planes taking off of a flat top, a aircraft carrier. Oh, there's a bomb sound. There we go. All right, here's some dog fights right there. All right, MacArthur did return to the Philippines at this point. So we had some battles. We started actually chasing the Japanese up the peninsula of the Philippines. And here he comes with his group. In fact, there was a big battle called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Notice it's 1944. Okay, so, and remember, we're going to go back in time when we're talking about what's going on in Europe. Okay, so Battle of Leyte Gulf. Here's Leyte down here. All right, and after this is when we're starting to take back piece by piece those parts of the Philippines. Now, I hate to just kind of gloss over it. It was brutal. Keep in mind, guys are dying every single day here. It was horrible, but even though it was incremental, we were making that headway into those islands. This was when the desperate idea of the kamikaze comes in. So if you remember, kamikaze just means wind, right? Conquering wind or something like this. And so these Japanese fighters realized that they were starting to lose the control out there of the islands. And so they decided to go for this thing called the kamikaze pilot. So this guy's tying his little bandana around his head, getting ready. It's considered very honorable, and he would take his plane and use his plane as a weapon. So he flew his plane right down into the ships of the Americans. All right, so what do you do with those guys, right? He's killing himself willingly, and he comes down, crashes into it. And of course, our guys are trying to shoot him down before he gets there, but they really couldn't believe it that these guys were willing to do that, but they were. Here you can see a kamikaze coming straight down on one of our battleships right here. And how in the world do you defend against that? Here's one of our guys trying to shoot him before he gets to there, trying to push him out of the way somehow so he doesn't actually hit our ship. Ships are large and difficult to maneuver, so it's not like you can steer out of the way of one of these guys coming very easily. Here's one that's just hit this ship, and we have guys just sitting here going, well, there we were hit, yeah. So brutal attack. Finally, the Philippines are liberated. By this time, we're going to end up finding our guys in that camp up there. Here we have an amphibious landing unopposed. All right, so the Japanese have moved up and out of the Philippines at this point. Here is a statue you can see today in the Philippines. It shows MacArthur coming ashore, and he says, when he said, I shall return, here he has returned. I have returned. Okay, we're moving on to some more islands. This is the Battle of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is a tiny island that was essentially unoccupied. People didn't live there. The only people who were there were the Japanese army, and they had dug into these mountains over here. They had this kind of labyrinth of caves and things like this. They're very elaborate, and they were hiding in there. And on this particular case, what they did was they allowed the Americans to go ahead and make the amphibious landing almost unopposed. They come in to the beaches. They're on the beachhead, and then the Japanese opened fire on them from the high ground right here. Once again, a brutal battle. This is the place where this happened. The Americans did climb to the top of a large, hill or mountain, if you want, called Mount Suribachi, and they raised up the American flag. This was not at the end of the battle. The battle continued on after this because of those hidden troops in the mountains, and they came out and engaged in more battle. There's a movie about this called Flags of Our Fathers, I believe that was what it's called, about how these guys were taken back home to America to go on a tour to promote people joining with the war and this kind of thing. They were unhappy to have left their troops. And then furthermore, this has been made into a very important statue that is in Arlington National Cemetery. All right, Tokyo firebombing. We are now close enough. Once we took Iwo Jima, we're close enough to actually send our bombers over to the island of Japan itself and drop bombs on the city of Tokyo, which is the capital of Japan. And the people there are going to now suffer like the islanders had been suffering all this time. You can see we call this carpet bombing. They just drop the bombs, just let them go, and they just hit anything. They're not really targeted toward anything specific, but here you can see we are over a harbor area, so maybe some ships may have been in there or something like that. And you can see Tokyo here destroyed. Okay. And the firebombing are the bombs that not only explode, but then spew out stuff that causes a fire. Okinawa, probably one of the worst at this point. One of the reasons that the Americans ended up finishing the war the way they did, which we'll talk about next week, was because the Japanese just refused to realize that it was really over for them. And so Okinawa was brutal. There were people living on it. It wasn't an unoccupied island. And the people living there had been so convinced by their own government that the Americans were these evil murderers that the people there, instead of surrendering to the Americans, they jumped off cliffs, and their whole families would jump off a cliff, and they killed themselves because they were afraid the Americans were going to be so brutal, which would not have been the case. All right, so back to the Philippines. When the Americans came back in, we did relieve our prisoners from the camps. Cabanatuan right here being one of the most, oh, here it is, Cabanatuan right here, camp being one of the most infamous right there, how we came to rescue them. So here are some of the guys. You can see some of them very thin. They were ill. They were in a tropical area where tropical diseases attack them and this kind of thing. Really quick, before, there's a movie about this one too called The Great Raid. It's very good. It's Americans again, so I cover it mostly in American history. Okay, meanwhile, we're going to go back now. We are going to see the African theater. It's kind of strange. Why in the world is anybody fighting in Africa? Well, it has to do with Mussolini. All right, so Mussolini, remember, had taken Ethiopia as a colony, and at this point, I think he's in Libya as well. And the British were down there fighting against the Italians. So Hitler decided to send some of his troops down to fight against the English in Africa. All right, because the Italians were very not great fighters there. All right, so we can see here that the blue is going to be our German troops coming in to fight against our UK troops that are here in areas like Algiers. So lots of battles here between Germans and UK, some Italians, I guess. See, here's Libya. And then we're going to see soon, we're going to have a Western Task Force come up there. We're going to have USA troops landing in Africa as well. All right, this is the German brilliant general called Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, because his ability to persecute the war out there in the desert was amazing. So they're in a desert of Africa. The desert wreaks havoc on your material, right? So the dust gets into your tanks and your weapons and clogs them up and this kind of thing. And so the Germans really kind of solved that with their really fancy tank called the Panzer, which means panther. And Rommel was brilliant. He was able to send his guys out, and they basically won all of their battles. The Afrika Korps, they were called. He was very famous. There's a battle in Tobruk. This is between the British and the Germans, and it's mostly a tank battle. And eventually what happened was the British were pushed back into the city of Tobruk, and some of the guys there were put under siege. So the Germans were sieging Tobruk, and they're called the Rats of Tobruk. They were kind of had a guerrilla warfare going on at that point. Here they are, the Rats of Tobruk. Those are British troops right here fighting against the Germans. All right, one of the British commanders was Bernard Law Montgomery, and he, to the rescue, brought out his crack tank troops and was able to actually make some inroads against the Afrika Korps of Rommel. The American tank turned out to be a really excellent tank for the desert as well. This is called the Sherman tank. It's very famous. It's actually named after William Tecumseh Sherman, the American general from the American Civil War. All right, so Operation Torch was right over here, where the USA is going to bring in a troop of tank commanders right here, and we're going to see them making an amphibious landing. I think it's called Operation Torch, and I believe their amphibious landing was unopposed. And then they brought on the tanks, and it was run by this guy, George S. Patton, the great tank commander. He's a tough guy. They call him Old Blood and Guts, and he now is going to work with Montgomery on pushing back Erwin Rommel. All right, interestingly, the Germans actually ended up deciding that Africa wasn't worth the fight. So they ended up pulling everyone out of Africa. And so once the Americans arrived and the British were fighting, then they abandoned Africa, and we're going to see then we're going to turn our attention toward Europe now. Okay, so we're already in Africa, and Patton is now going to invade Sicily. This is at the bottom of the boot, right, of Italy. And so he comes in with his tanks and made quick work of everything in Sicily. You know, in fact, he just won every single battle along the way. At this point, the Germans are leaving here. They are hopping over to Italy. And right about now is when Italy dropped out of the war. Okay, the people of Italy decided that they did not want to fight with the Germans anymore. They actually switched sides. This happened in World War I as well, but now it's going to happen, and Mussolini was arrested by the people of Italy. All right, so here we see Mussolini getting arrested. He was deposed and arrested, and he was put into a mountain jail in a hotel, this really nice ski resort, and he was put up in there. So now what we have is we have the Americans. Here we have Sicily. So Patton and his troops would have come over. They have to cross over the water right here to get to the toe of Italy, and they're going to work their way up with battles, and they get to this part right here, which is known as the Gustav Line. It comes down here, also called the Hitler Line, right there, and that's where they're going to have a big battle that's going to last some time. Now, keep in mind who's fighting here. Americans are fighting against Germans in Italy, and the Italians have now switched to our side. Not that they added much to our armies at this point. Okay, so here is the Gustav Line right here. So we're going to see some battles right here, and we're going to try to push past this Gustav Line. You can see the Adolf Hitler line right here, Gustav Line right there. And right here is called Monte Cassino. There is a beautiful ancient monastery at the top of a mountain. I mean, we're talking thousands of years old, and we're going to end up destroying it, sadly. Okay, but also the American troops decided to land above the Gustav Line, and they landed at a place called Anzio. It was a huge amphibious landing, brutal. Once again, American troops fighting against German troops. All right, here we are at Monte Cassino. Our guys are shooting up to the mountain. On top of the mountain, of course, the Italians said, please don't destroy our beautiful monastery that's thousands of years old. And we said, oh, no, we won't. We would leave it alone unless the Germans are using it for cover, which they did. So it's their fault that Monte Cassino, right here, Monte Cassino, is going to end up getting destroyed. Okay, and the Germans are going to start retreating at this point because the Americans are going to start pushing them up. There's Monte Cassino, sadly, utterly destroyed, and it's too bad because from a historical point of view, it was a beautiful old monastery. Yeah, there it goes. All right, the Anzio landing's brutal as they come along the beach there. This is a little bit later when they're bringing more material on. They did actually win that battle at Anzio after much death. It was horrible. And the Germans at this point, just like they had decided that Africa wasn't worth it, they decide Italy's not worth it. So they are moving out of Italy. So the American troops now march into Rome unopposed. And so there was no fighting in Rome, no destruction of Roman ancient stuff. Now this is the ski resort where Mussolini was kept as a prisoner. There he is. All right, he's being guarded by Italian troops. Now this ski resort is up high in a mountain, and the only way you can get to it is through a cable car. You know, so like if you're going on a ski resort and you go up a ski lift, so this is the only way you can get to this. Now at this point, Hitler wants to rescue his friend, his hapless friend, and he comes up with this incredible plan. You may not have ever heard this story before. I find it fascinating. Because what we have is the German plan to come and rescue Mussolini. And what they did was, this man was charged with it. His name is Scorzani, and he said the best way to get into the place, it's way up high, the air is thin. They actually dropped down several gliders. Gliders would also be very quiet. So gliders came in landed on the plain next to the hotel there, and and others had invaded the town below, taken over the cable car, and cut the lines, cut phone lines, and cut the electricity to the cable car until they wanted to use it. Look at Skorzeny. What a Nazi, right? Look at the scar on the face and everything. Oh my goodness. All right. So the Italian guards who were watching Mussolini there, it was fairly, you know, well guarded. I mean, maybe 100 troops or something in there guarding him. They surrendered almost immediately, like Italians, right? And and then Skorzeny was able to actually get Mussolini out. Here he is. And they said, how in the world can we get him off this mountaintop without ending up in territory down at the bottom of the mountain that would have had, U.S. troops fairly close by, at least, on the way up there. So they decided to bring in one airplane. So after they had secured the hotel, they brought in one airplane. It's a two-seater for two people, and they're going to take off with Mussolini in the plane. Here he is. And there's Skorzeny, who actually got in the plane with him. All right, which meant there was a pilot too, so that means 3 people. And it was too heavy. So Skorzeny was not about to let his incredible catch go without his getting full credit for it. So he gets in the plane starts to take off on this mountain, and as it's just like in a movie, right? So it goes off that cliff, and boom, he drops down way below like he's falling, and then vroom, brings that plane up, and he actually was successful in getting Mussolini out. Is crazy. So he was able to take him eventually to Vienna, which was owned by Germany. And here is Skorzeny shaking the hand of his Führer, his leader, and he was awarded the Knight's Cross right there on the spot. All right, so he was considered a big hero in Hitler's eyes. And now Mussolini is going to be with Hitler in Germany until a little later when he tries to get back into Italy. All right, so speaking of Hitler, here he is. We haven't really talked about him much personally. This is he with his girlfriend, Eva Braun, at a place called the Berghof. Berghof was a really nice, I'm not going to call it a castle, it was a lovely home at the top of a mountain. And during times when Hitler was resting, he would go there with her, and it was quite lovely. In fact, you can find quite a bit of footage of them there, and the footage is even in color. Of them enjoying themselves at the Berghof Hotel, basically, in Germany. Okay, now remember, the Nazis had control of France, and it was very, very close to England. All right, so they were occupied in the northern part with Paris as the capital, and Vichy France in the lower part where Vichy was the capital. And we're going to see next week some resistance of the French, especially from this city called Lyon right here. It's fascinating stuff. We'll see that next week. All right, so they began what is known as the Battle of Britain. Every night they came in with airplanes from France and dropped bombs all over England, southern England. London was bombed by them. So people living there, these are regular old, people, civilians getting bombed. It was really a bad time here. So we're in the 1940s now. In fact, I think the Battle of Britain may have been taking place before America even joined the war. Okay, here's a guy standing on top of a roof watching for planes, and if you heard something like this, yeah, it meant find someplace to hide. All right, so they had to go into air shelters. They had underground, like a subway, and those were a good place for people to go hide from the bombs. All right, here are the children told to duck and cover. So if bombs were coming, that perhaps maybe their desks might save them from bombing. I don't know. Lots of civilians were killed. Here are people who have made their own bomb shelters in their backyards. They have their little boxes of food. They're going to go in there when they hear the alarms going off. If you happen to be lucky enough to be at home, then you could go into your little bomb shelter. If you were not, you had to go find a place in the city, right? Here they are down in the tube, they call it. It's the subway station, and they're all sitting down there waiting for the bombs to finish. Also, they had to have their windows covered with dark blankets so that no light came out. So at night when they were dropping bombs, if they had seen any light, they would have said, ooh, there's a target, and they would have dropped it right there. We're not going to watch that. Okay. At this point, we're going to see here we're still in June of 1940, so America hasn't even come into the war yet. Let's listen to part of a very famous speech by Winston Churchill.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
All right, so this was their finest hour. His speeches were really excellent to bring the people up to continue fighting. It's quite amazing how they handled this. Here they are in the city of London, putting out fires. You know, as soon as those bombs would drop, then the firemen would come out and put those out. Look at the rubble. It was destroyed right here. Here's a guy delivering the milk, right? So this shows kind of, they call it the stiff upper lip of the British right there. He's delivering that milk even in the midst of all of this chaos. All right, this is an interesting story. One of the Nazi top henchmen of Hitler right here was convinced that if he flew into England, he could actually talk them into some sort of, I don't know, how to make a peace. They could make a peace. One of the things that Hitler wanted to do was to make peace with England, and then he would just have to fight against Russia. So Rudolf Hess was probably a little crazy, and he flew in to England to try to make this connection, and ended up crashing his airplane up in Scotland, and he was taken and then put into prison for the remainder of the war. He might be a good person to check on as far as a biography goes. Remember, your biography will be due in a couple of weeks, and you're going to be using a world figure, not an American. Okay. Here he is, his plane crashed, he was captured, and I believe he was the longest serving Nazi in jail. He was like lived until the 1960s or something like that. Yeah, here he is captured. That's him later, I think, at the Nuremberg trials. All right, the U-boats, the wolf packs are still in full force out there, just like in World War I. They had built these amazing submarines that were still wreaking havoc all through the naval areas. Here you can see that they would have been sending out torpedoes to all these British naval ships. You can see through their periscope here, they look up through there and they see where the ship is, and they can send their torpedoes over. Meanwhile, in Russia, yikes. Okay, so Russia was also very bleak at this point. We have the invasion of Russia by the Germans. Apparently, Hitler hadn't read his history books, right? Like with Napoleon. You can see here in 1941, so still before America's in, they're making the attack in Operation Barbarossa. And you can see they're winning battles along here against the poor, hapless Russians at this point. But what is who's the best general in Russia? General Winter, right? Things got very, very cold, and the Germans are having to deal with that cold. The Russians are kind of used to it. So they come to Leningrad, the city of Leningrad, and they begin a siege, which was pretty brutal. And then Stalingrad, another siege. You can see the Russians here are defending their city. Yeah, I have a little thing about it here.
Battle of Stalingrad, August 23, 1942 to February 2nd, 1943. As the Germans advanced towards Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the war came to the locals of the city, and evacuation was slow to the speed of the Wehrmacht's advancement. Because the city bore Stalin's name, it was of high importance for the morale of the Soviet forces to hold it. The desperation for Soviet resistance to the German advance was clear. Work frantically continued in the weapon factories. T-34 tanks could be seen rushed into battle, unpainted, and sometimes lacking gun sights. Men not already in the Red Army were formed into militia and sent into battle, sometimes without proper training and with high casualties. Women and children dug trenches and built protective fortifications, but would also fight as machine gunners, in gun crews, and as scouts and snipers. On the 12th of September, the first German troops moved into the city. They chose to attack straight into the urban area and soon found themselves in brutal close-quarters house-to-house battles. The Soviets established frontline positions as close as possible to the German lines, which was the safest place from German air and artillery attacks. In August, Stalin had sent his top general, Georgy Zhukov, to supervise the whole southern front, and Vasily Chuikov took over the 62nd Army in the city. While Zhukov prepared for a counteroffensive, Chuikov pushed his troops into combat. When asked how he interpreted his task, he responded, "We will defend the city or die in the attempt." Reinforcements were ferried under fire across the Volga into the ruins, with enough troops making it to the other side to keep at least part of the city in Soviet hands. Soviet casualties were immensely high, but German casualties were mounting as well. To ensure the defense of Stalingrad, Stalin had issued Order Number 227 on July 27, 1942, known as Not One Step Backwards. Armies were formed with a second line of barrier troops behind them who acted as a last line of defense. Officers and soldiers who deserted could also be sent to penal battalions, which was a virtual death sentence. Red Army troops built a maze of trenches in damaged buildings and used the sewer system to sneak past the enemy. Both sides employed snipers, and the destroyed buildings of Stalingrad made it an ideal environment for cover. The most famous Soviet sniper celebrated as a hero was Vasily Zaitsev, with 225 confirmed kills. At the end of September and in mid-October, the Germans came close to victory, but the defenders clung onto part of the city's northern factory district. The advance to Stalingrad brought other problems for the Axis forces. Hitler had fired several of his generals in the summer after arguments over his strategic plan. Now he was making many command decisions himself. The winter caused problems for both sides, breaking down tanks and making weapons more difficult to operate. However, the Red Army had better clothing for the freezing cold conditions, with quilted jackets and fur hats. Stalingrad had expanded the German front, and as a consequence, the Italian and Romanian armies were brought in to support the flanks of the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army. Fighting inside Stalingrad was sapping German forces and causing them to pull units from flanks into the city. The Romanian and Italian troops were poorly trained and had low morale. Therefore, they would be the first targets for the planned Soviet counteroffensive. The Soviets attacked Hungarian positions north of Stalingrad on November 19th, and to the south the next day, devastating the Romanian fronts. Within a week, the two advancing Red Army forces had joined up and cut Stalingrad off. General Paulus asked permission to break out, which he could have done, but Hitler refused, instead promising to resupply the trapped German army by air. General Erich von Manstein was brought in to lead a relief attempt for the surrounded pocket, but had to retreat before Christmas. The air supply effort also cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of transport aircraft and only managed to deliver a fraction of its supplies. Now short of fuel, food, and ammunition, the German 6th Army now faced superior forces all around them. The last German troops in the city would surrender on February 2nd, 1943, but sporadic fighting around the city went on until March. The Battle of Stalingrad was a crushing blow to Nazi Germany, and the losses to the Wehrmacht could not adequately be replaced.
All right, so you see how the Germans ended up being sieged in Stalingrad. Crazy. All right, so let's bring this up. We have what the Germans called the Jewish problem. that they had seen that the Jewish population were part of the reason that things were so bad, like as far as the economic depression and things like that. So we're going to see over here in Poland several camps that are being formed to put these, if it has this skull here, it's called a death camp, where they were taken there actually for extermination. I mean, so that it wasn't like they accidentally said, oh, well, let's kill them. No, that was the plan. And we're going to see how, and next week we'll talk more specifically about that. So we're going to look at Treblinka right here. Anytime the Germans came into a new area and took it over, so remember they're headed in Russia, so they're coming through right here, they would round up the Jewish population and put them in some of these camps. We have Auschwitz, Birkenau here, Treblinka. Those are some of the most famous of them, if you will, infamous. Sobibor, and they were rounded up and put there. So in Warsaw, in Poland itself, they actually built a wall around the inner part of the city where the Jews already lived. So he basically walled them into their city. And it's called the ghetto, where they would be walled in. They couldn't leave. They could move about within the ghetto, but they couldn't leave go through the walls at all right there. So in this particular case, you could say, well, it's better than a death camp. Well, yeah, I mean, they had their own leadership and they had their churches that they could, their synagogues where they could meet and this kind of thing and pray. But they weren't supplied very well, so they weren't getting very much food brought into the place for them. Okay. We're going to see here they're being rounded up. Some of them are going to be sent off to camps, even some in the Warsaw Ghetto, especially if they were thought to be, rebelling in some way. So these people are lined up to go to Treblinka. Notice we have children, we have women, we have men, families being put onto rail cars, and they're like the kind of rail car that you would have animals on. It's not like they had seats or anything in there. They were all standing up inside these cattle cars and taken to the extermination camps. All right, so there was an uprising within the Warsaw Ghetto. We have a very resourceful group of people who are making weapons, somehow smuggling some guns and things in, and this picture down here shows them going up against one of the walls in Warsaw and fighting against. We have Germans actually coming in to put down the uprising, which, sad to say, they did put the uprising down. The people of Warsaw were very brutally treated after this. In fact, they were rounded up. This is a famous picture that was taken at the time of the people of Warsaw being rounded up, fixing to go to a camp. And this little boy right here, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this boy survived the war. I'm kind of thinking that's the case. Others, not so great. They were actually rounded up, stood up against the wall, one of the walls where they were trying to get out of the Warsaw, and they were summarily shot by those Germans. Okay, awful. All right, so things at this point are starting to look better for the Allied nations. Okay, so what we have going on is the war in the Pacific is happening, and there's some headway being made against the Japanese over there. And then now against the Russians and the Germans, we have that Stalingrad was a success for the Russians. And so we have a meeting of the big three. So this is Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin meeting in a city called Yalta. They're called the Big Three, and they're going to make a decision how to proceed to bring this war to an end more quickly. And one of the things they decided that day was to go ahead and bomb the city of Dresden. Dresden is in Germany. It was a large city with lots and lots of civilians, but they also had several factories that were making armaments and making ammunition that were supplying the German army, especially the German army that had moved toward the Russia area. And so they decided to go with what is known as a firestorm. Similar to what happened in Tokyo, they dropped bombs on the city, carpet bombing, just dropped it all over, and the bombs, once they exploded, they had incendiary chemicals in them that caused the place to catch on fire. Many people look back at this today and think this was the wrong decision. It was inhumane and this kind of thing, but they thought it was time for some big guns at this point. You can see Dresden here afterward. It's fairly destroyed. It burned to the ground, essentially. This is an interesting view from the top of a church. You can see the destruction of the city right there. I mean, it was just total destruction. And lots of civilian deaths took place here. All right, so now everyone knows that there's going to be an invasion of France. They just don't know when and where. And so the Allies are trying to come up with a few tricks up their sleeves, and this is one of the most fascinating of all of them. This is George Patton, old blood and guts, right? He is put in charge of a ghost army. All right, so between France and England, there is a place called Dover, and it's right across the English Channel from a place called Calais. And that's the closest spot between England and France. So most people believed that the invasion would take place there because it's the easiest way to cross the English Channel. And so because most people believed that, the Allies came up with this cool plan to put Patton, an army, in Dover. All right? And so we're going to see that it was a ghost army. You see right here we have a tank made out of balloons. All right? And these guys would pick them up and move them every day. So from above, when the Germans flew their airplanes over, it looked like an actual tank. And furthermore, from one day to another, they could see it had moved. And so they thought that the Allies were mustering for an invasion of France over there at Calais from Dover. Here you can see a wooden plane. So from above, it looks like an actual plane. And they could, I believe, move this one around not quite as easily. Here you can see some trucks, and that's a howitzer gun back there, all made from inflatables. All right, so they're not real. And Patton's in charge of it. I love this picture right here. These are mannequins. All right, they could move these mannequins around. That's a real Jeep. These might be real people over here. But they had this little army base set up there. And so the Germans were convinced that that's where the attack was going to take place. But it didn't. They actually were going to attack elsewhere. Which brings us to June 6th, 1944, known as D-Day. You've heard of it, right? It was an operation called Operation Overlord. And this man was in charge of it. He's an American general. His name is Dwight David Eisenhower. And he will be in charge of all of the troops to coordinate coming onto an amphibious landing onto the beaches of Normandy. So if you recall, Normandy is that part of northern France. Remember why it's called Normandy? Because the Northmen, the Vikings, lived there. That's where Rollo the Viking had made his deal with Charles, King Charles, way back in the day. So that's where the invasion is going to take place. So you can see here, so way over to the right off screen is where Calais is and Dover. That's where Patton's, army was, his ghost army was. So, but what happened on the 6th is we have an amphibious landing. First thing that happened was airplanes came in and dropped paratroopers in places like Cherbourg and these little towns right here. Bayeux, remember the Bayeux Tapestry is there. You should remember that. And then we have the British paratroopers coming into Le Havre. And what they're doing, they're also dropping bombs around here to soften the target. But the Germans had fortified this entire place right here. They called it the Atlantic Wall. It actually went all the way up into Belgium. It was a wall. And so we're trying to figure out how to attack. So they're going to make a beach landing. The Americans came in on Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. The British came in on Gold and Sword. And then the Canadians came in on Juno right there. They invaded on the 5th, but they had to turn back because of weather. So on the 6th is when they made this incursion onto the beach. It was another brutal attack because just beyond the beach, I'll show you a picture in a minute, there are high cliffs that are right there. And guess who was dug in very well at the high cliffs? The Germans. In fact, all of the German armaments and battlement areas has been designed and put into place by Erwin Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, who had been taken out of Africa, of course, and brought up to this area. He was in charge of this. It turns out that Erwin Rommel wasn't there on that day. He was at home visiting his wife for her birthday, but he made his way back very quickly to meet with this invasion that was taking place. All right, I love this story right here. This is called the Pointe du Hoc. It's a region of that northern coast right there. It's over there by the Utah Beach. And up here is a German embattlement right here. So they have what's known as a pillbox. I believe that's probably right now a some sort of statue or something to commemorate what was going on. So this is the Pointe du Hoc, sometimes called the Pointe du Hoc. And we're going to see, we had some Army Rangers who were tasked with literally climbing up this sheer cliff. Yikes. Here they are. They're actually putting together pieces as they move to make a type of a ladder to get up to the top. This was done afterwards, so this was like a reenactment right here. I'm not sure if this is live, but notice how they're making their little funny little ladder there. Then once they got to the top, they can throw over a rope for others. They also set up grappling hooks, to hook onto the top. Here's an artist rendition where you can see that grappling hook right here. Here's a guy coming to the top. As soon as they got up there, guess what? They were met by fierce fire from those Germans who were encamped there. We had literally, y'all, 90% casualties for this group that went up here, this group of Army Rangers. A lot of them, in fact, the commander was a Texan. 90% casualties. You remember, casualty means dead or wounded. All right. They did liberate towns like Cherbourg. That was up there at the top of France. And these are Germans coming out and having surrendered. All right. And then we're going to see now the battles that are going to take place to push the Germans back into Germany. You can see Paris here. They're coming down. Here's the Normandy invasions. They're going to come in, move in, slowly, push the Germans back. And we finally here will now have the liberation of Paris. They were able to push the Germans out, and we can see here, this is Charles de Gaulle, the president of France. He had left the country when the Germans had come in and had been living in London this whole time with basically an army of his own, a French army, and now he is going to victoriously come marching into Paris. All right, so we're going to end here today and pick up what's going on. So right now I want you to know we have the Japanese mostly on the run at this point, and also the Germans mostly on the run at this point. Okay, everybody, enjoy. I feel confident that I'll be back next week and we'll be able to see what happened to end this war. All right, very good. Bye.